Hello and welcome to Between Two Servers, the show from multiplayer game developers, by game developers, for game developers. I'm here with Dean Hall. He's the creator of DayZ. He's climbed Mount Everest. Welcome to the show, Dean.
Good to be here.
Yeah.
Talk multiplayer.
That's awesome, mate. So are you in Dunedin right now, down in New Zealand?
Auckland in New Zealand. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So DayZ, obviously a huge multiplayer game. Let's do we'll do a quick montage in post showing you what it was like.
Mm-hmm.
So Dean, what do you think made DayZ so unique when you first created it?
I think it was the emotional connections that it made. So sort of looking at an angle, how to get a player feeling like they owned something, i.e. not just that sort of moment to moment, that session that they were playing them, but to try and give them a wider ownership of it. The example I usually use is if I say like, this is your car for an hour versus this is your car forever. People treat the car differently.
That's very interesting. So was this a result of the permadeath that you did? Or was it holistically a larger thing?
I think that was a huge component of it. So the permadeath gave you that sense of loss. Yeah. But having your character persist between different sessions that you join. So if I joined your game server on a Wednesday, but I came back on a Friday and I joined another one, but I still had the same character.
Yeah.
And Valheim did that. That's something Valheim did as well.
That's
or does, I should say.
Yeah. So that was pretty unique when it first came out.
Yeah, it was. Definitely. There were a few unique elements, and I think together with the fact that the Armor engine had a very large map for the time, certainly, and quite a detailed map. That was, I suppose, a big part of it as well.
Very cool. After having sort of laid the ground for these large open world games, what's your opinion on PUBG and Fortnite?
So I remember talking to Brendan just before PUBG released. I think I caught up with him a few times. I caught up with him at PAX Australia just before it released. And I didn't really think it was going to be that huge. I remember thinking that just because, it still had a few problems. It was still, it was mainly like store-bought assets from the Unreal Asset Store. I haven't been the biggest advocate of Unreal, particularly in terms of its multiplayer sometimes. It's funny because every time I Google something, I come across stuff you say, which is always funny. You're like everywhere. So I think we have similar opinions there. But but I was obviously very wrong. And I think what it did is it took that DayZ style gameplay and it put a great structure around it.
Yeah.
So it gave people an expectation of what a play session was going to be like, which helped streamers because they could plan their content. And people knew how long it would last. It was very easy to explain to their friends what you were going to be doing. You didn't have to say, we're going to go in and we're going to spend 2 hours fighting each other. And then we're going to, gear up over the next 6 hours. And then we're going to find a helicopter. And they'll be like, well, why?
Which by the way, is totally fucking cool, but on a totally different frequency.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think it helped provide a lot of structure around the player's play experience.
Cool. So how did you land on DayZ? So I've read in the past, mate, like, military background, crazy exercises in Brunei, running out of food sort of inspired it. How much do you credit your military experience with the experience of DayZ? Could someone have made a game like this without having the experience that you had?
I definitely think someone can make those experiences. There's a lot of people who'd knocked around that kind of area. I think there were two big factors to it.
Mm-hmm.
One was I'd been running this gaming group called USEC, which was a military division of a gaming group I'd run for Flight Sim. So Flight Sim, for a long time, since the 90s, had these things called virtual airlines, which were just gaming groups, but used flight simulation. Hardcore. Yeah, I know. I used Flight Simulator to basically, play together, pretending it was an airline and you'd have to file flights and that. So I actually run that since I was in university. And that got me into databasing and, ASP.NET and stuff like that. So I made the whole website, and I made a SDK to link Flight Sim and Armor to this database. That probably had the most profound impact on the background. I made my first C++ apps doing that, because I was like, well, I need to make I think for a start, I was using the clipboard, no joke, to transfer data between Armor and the database.
Hey,
because
we've all done silly things.
Yeah, I mean, but it worked. Like, So the Armor server that I was running would have like a transaction that it would pass using the clipboard. And that transaction would be picked up by my like central server C++ app. It would just, then I discovered named pipes, which obviously was a little better than the clipboard.
So you're literally teaching yourself programming to implement things you just wanted to play with.
Yeah, and I suppose that was my entire programming history. I from encountering a Commodore 64, I started doing computer science, but I was even worse than I am now. And I was just like, I'm not learning. I think I didn't feel like I was learning fast enough. I needed to give it a little bit more of a shot. I think first year was pretty average. So I think if I'd given it a shot further, I would have carried on with it.
What's your ability level in programming these days? How do you rate yourself?
It's been getting a lot better. So we kind of rebooted the whole studio just before we started Icarus, even moved sites. So that's why I'm in Auckland now.
Oh, that's so Dunedin to Auckland?
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Which is quite a hike for people who don't. It's most of the way across Europe if you plot to New Zealand there. And we ended up hiring a lot of Grinding Gear Games devs, a number of the very senior technical staff from the Grinding Gear Games team, and a guy called Ben Carnell, who used to work for, I can't remember it now, the name of it.
You mean Weta?
No, he worked at they do the AI computer spaces.
Magic Leap? No,
not Magic Leap.
So many New Zealand companies.
There is. Yeah. But they do the AI avatar things. Anyway, amazing programmer. And cool. Just being around those guys, because I'm allowed little hobby projects at the studio, and I just go and ask them questions. That's just, it just really reinforces that.
Go over the corner, Dean. Go right.
And every time I'm Googling something, I come across this name, Glenn.
Oh, that's
usually usually quite a sassy post, I might add.
I like a little bit of English on the stick. Yeah. So your personal background, obviously, like a technical designer, really. Like you're able to do modding, you're able to do programming as needed. How can someone come into the industry and honestly, in 2022, I think you'd almost have to be like a pure narrative designer. I mean, is there really a position these days for a pure designer who can't program?
I think there is. Certainly on larger teams. I think, particularly with the kind of games that I tend to tackle, I definitely think you need to have at least a streak of game developer in you.
Yeah.
So, a game developer plays the game, and that's our big philosophy: is games are played, not made. And actually, if you look at Icarus, Icarus had a very mixed reception, even still to this day. A lot of that comes from a period of 3 to 6 months when we couldn't play the game. Yeah. We piled too much stuff in, so the frame was bad. We were CPU and GPU bound, and our multiplayer didn't work for like two months.
That's a tragedy, because then you're like so far from where you need to be, and you got to get back.
Well, you don't know where you are. And then you get these camps forming in your game. Yeah. So particularly because we'd rebooted the studio, it was a new one. Then you have a group of people saying, well, the meta loop doesn't work. We don't have the meta loop, and we've got to focus on that. And I'm like, we've got to focus on the basics. Yeah. The basics we can't even connect
the core loop
freaking game. Yeah. The core loop. And so we were sort of in this situation. Yes, we could get more money to nothing's free, but we could get more money to develop further. But we needed the game to see the light of day in terms of the customers, because the customers always tell you what's wrong with your product, and the minute you release it, you're like, oh yeah, it needs blah.
So that's another really big thing about your career is just this intense push to get it out in front of everybody and to develop it with the community. Where'd that
that's quite insightful, actually, because privately it's funny because people will sort of, on the internet people will meme that Dean Hall doesn't finish anything, but actually I think probably one of my biggest achievements would be getting DayZ standalone out. DayZ standalone was, it was a bit messy, but it was like a super mess even 2 months before release. We had gone in and just gutted the real virtuality engine, or I can't remember what they call it, but the Armor engine, and then mushed in, some other stuff. And so there was a lot of change in there. And even from that multiplayer standpoint, a lot of Googling, a lot of reading your posts and other people's posts. But yeah, I think there's a tremendous value in anyone working in games understanding how they're made. Yeah. I think when I used to make a lot of flight sim mods, it meant that I was doing art, programming, data structures. I feel like that's a massively misunderstood area. Everybody's just like, oh, JSON. Well, JSON's really good, but it's not always good.
Yeah.
How you structure the data of your game. I would never use the data structures provided by Unity or Unreal. I always, if you want to do modding, I just,
it's a core competency, because you know that you're going in here with, I want to be able to do this as a modder, so I want to enable my game to be modded that way. Let's talk a bit about that. What do you do to make your game moddable? How do you bring the community?
Controversial opinion. So I like XML for game data. Not exclusively. I think there is some better ways to do it. I'm quite inspired by how the Paradox team, I don't know if you've ever unpacked their game data. It's sort of like a variation of JSON. The problem I have with JSON is trying to get my head around it visually. When I look at it, it's just so JSON to me is perfect if you're wanting the computer to talk to the computer. But for me, because there's no real structure around, or no real decision around whether something's an attribute or an element, you can use a point.
When you're designing it, you're like, should it be? I don't know. You just,
and that's
whatever
bad.
You want.
That's bad. But in this situation, it's good, because I try and I use that to my advantage. Do I want it to go across the page, or do I want it to go down, so that I can go through
and structuring it? Yeah.
But I really like having the game data in a raw format like that, and then almost as a focal point between the game. We use JSON for Icarus. We'll see how that goes when people have unpacked it with modding, so it's totally possible. I suppose it's a question of taste. Also, if you're using C#, XML just works so well with reflection. Like, you can just turn your and into it.
So are you folks mostly using a Unity core these days? You've moved away from Unreal with some of your custom secret sauce in there? Or?
I hate them both with a deep core belief. But I think look at them. I look at them both as
they're so different. They're so different. Like different philosophies behind them.
I suppose in my heart, I like C++ better because it breeds good programmers and good behaviors. So we've got one of our really good, our highest skilled and paid engineer is helping. So our philosophy is we'll use the right tool for the job. That might be writing our own engine, which for some of our projects, not writing our own engine, but writing our own conglomeration of tools. Or using Unity, or using Unreal, or using Unity as a renderer, or using Unreal as a renderer, basically. But I find that C# allows people, they're abstracted from the impact of what they're doing. So they don't know whether they're putting something on the heap or the stack. There's no thought behind it. And then I think you turn around and you go, well, you've allocated all this nonsense that the
Yeah.
garbage collector is going to have to clean up.
Yeah,
And
you're doing it every frame, and it's like leaks, and then you get hitches. Yeah.
yeah, every Unity game goes through that. Everyone, Tarkov is still a bit struggling with that. So.
I actually, I'm a huge fan of what Mike Acton's doing. I think obviously it's quite far out still, but that whole, the entity component system, and sort of like, here's the fast path, here's the straight and narrow Mike Acton data oriented programming.
I like that, but my concern is whenever they do that, it starts to get that Joint Strike Fighter problem where, one person says, I'm going to do this, and this is the use case I've got for it. And then someone else is like, well, I'm doing something kind of similar. Maybe we can team up.
To be fair, not everybody's going to want to, not every aspect of a game should be written in the hardcore Mike Acton way. Right?
Yeah, I think, so I was very inspired by what was happening with the entity component system. So I've been working on this little train game as a kind of hobby project of mine, and to try and take all the things that we hadn't worked in our other games and stuff like that, and see if I could sort of fix them. And I ended up sort of doing the same thing, but I just don't like, for how Unity's doing it, how strict it is with having to copy across data and native arrays. It can end up really expensive. So I kind of did the same thing, like at the start of the frame, if you imagine I've got all these little vehicles, all these little trains. At the start of the frame, I assign all the vehicles to a worker. And that worker, it does a cost estimate on the vehicle. How many wheels does the vehicle have? How long is it? And how much pathfinding does it have to do? Does it have to go very far? And I use that to try and load balance it a bit. And then I basically, those workers are just a class that can be dumped on the C# thread pool system. And then while the main thread's happening, these little workers are going off doing their business. And then at the beginning of the next frame, my main thread goes, are all the workers finished? Nope. Okay, I'm going to lock up and wait.
Okay. So you really don't want to have them too long. But,
no, but I actually have come around to that. That's a good thing, because you want all of that work. That just made everything so much more deterministic. I could, I knew then when I went to apply the results of that, I knew that everything had a path. I knew that all the vehicles and all its children were what positions they were in.
There's this sort of pernicious thing amongst programmers of like creating the most complicated, flexible, future-proof. And you know what? Sometimes just throw it off frame and come back next frame and just blow up if it's not there, or hang. I asked some folks, like, again, I wasn't on the original Call of Duty team. I got to work with some of them on Titanfall. But at one point, one of them was like, I'm like, how the fuck how do you guys hit 60? Like, how the fuck? Because let me tell you, being on God of War, they're not hitting 60. It's not really a studio-wide priority. It's does it look like insane next-gen art, and and it might be like a floating frame rate in 60 or 60-ish in some places, but it'll be like 30, 35 in others. Now, for multiplayer, I really feel that at 60, just for the interactivity and the smoothness is really important. Personal opinion. But I asked him, how did you do it? We just crash the game if you don't make the frame. Right?
Yeah, I'm a big believer in that. Like, throw exceptions. And in some circumstances, well, in a lot of circumstances, if this thing's broken here, then just break everything. So we went through a lessons learned, and so in December last year was a pretty soul-seeking moment for us. Obviously, Icarus did fine, but I think it would have done a lot better. And we really drank the Kool-Aid on a lot of engine functionality. And I think you should be very cautious doing that. I'm not suggesting, again, I'll crap on all the engines, but I'll do the same with the things we clobber together ourselves. That's just natural. You're always going to complain about the hammer you're using to bang something in. But I think that, you've got to be very careful sort of trusting that, here's this feature, here's that feature.
You should use as little as you can get away with.
Oh yeah,
Everything's a risk. Everything's a risk.
At work, I hate features. I hate features, particularly engine features. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. So we've been really struggling with Stationeers, one of our Unity projects, and one of our other ones. We just use the Unity low-level API for multiplayer, which allows you to send byte arrays.
Is that a new one? Or is
no,
that
super old.
It's the old Unity UNet.
Yeah, that's right. But only the low-level API. So basically only, hey, make a connection, hey, send a byte array. We're actually ditching that for RACnet. And but the funny thing, the reason is
guys not working on it anymore, man.
Yeah, well, no, but that's right. But that's the thing. The problem we had is our programmers were like, oh, well, it hasn't been touched in 8 years. But the problem was with Icarus, we went out and we grabbed every new thing we could find. We're not looking at doing it for Icarus, what I might add. But this is the problem I have sometimes with our programmers is people are always wanting the new thing. You know, we were Perforce crazy.
I can share a story. So Network Next is 5 years old. And I think 2 years in, we were like, we got to scale. We got to scale Kubernetes. And then we went hard in on Kubernetes for 6 months. I kid you not, I probably lost $5 million on Kubernetes.
So man, so you realize
it's so complicated you can just blow your head off.
We spent millions of dollars, and we're about, and it, not only is it unnecessary for what we were doing, it's hurt us. We'd have to have call outs and it's been,
I couldn't deal with it because I was like, hey, redacted, like I can't even run the microservices on my laptop, and she was on Windows, and I'm just like, it's not okay. It's just not okay. If you can't run it, you can't reproduce it. Did
you know? So that's very serendipitous. You didn't know, presumably, we were doing that with Icarus. Yeah, nope. No. So it's
my own pain.
Yeah,
we got to share pain here.
I think what happened was there was a point in development. I really wanted us to approach our data structure in the same way we had with DayZ, but my knowledge in that area hadn't improved in 10 years. And my knowledge was kind of old back then. And so I do think that there's this thinking sometimes, the magic beans, thinking everything's different. And this happens on a graphical feature level as well as, memory, as well as bandwidth, everything. Back end.
Yeah, middleware.
We haven't really fundamentally changed a lot of things. People's, I think I came across a thread talking about MTU and how, things haven't
still
changed
1500,
a lot.
Mate. Yeah. I mean, maybe 10 years ago, we were like, don't go over 1,000.
500 even.
I mean, 20 years ago, but these days, like 1350, whatever. And here's a cool thing, Dan. I've had multiple customers and friends at the company, and they're like, we got this one player, and like the packets just don't get through every now and then. I'm like, are you sending larger than MTU? Yeah, I do. It fixes it because some networks will just drop every single packet larger than MTU. It just won't even get through. It's going, nope.
Yeah. And then
you can't predict
security reasons, even though they're supposed to like tell you what's happening, for some security reasons, a lot of networks will just be like, nope.
Black hole. Yeah. No, for real. So the Kubernetes thing on our side, what we did is we just replaced it we just went, okay, we're in Google Cloud. We don't have any reason to go anywhere but Google Cloud. We're all in on Google Cloud. We didn't need multi-cloud. We just used managed instance groups, load balancers, auto scaling in Google Cloud, zero Kubernetes. And in 1 year, we dug our way out of the hole. But we completely rewrote everything. Absolutely everything.
I think it demonstrates, the problem with it demonstrates my problem in general with where tech is at the moment, which is we keep abstracting ourselves from what happens. It's like when you
don't want to be the guinea pig,
Yeah, when you first explain to one of our, we get a entrant programmer come in and they've got strings everywhere. They're using strings to drum everything. And I'm like, what is a string? And there's a shrug. It's like, okay, a string's an array of numbers. Is that, you know, is that the best way for you to be handling this thing with an array of numbers, you know? And yeah, I just think people end up really abstracted. That's why I do really, even though I don't use it myself anymore, really, I do really like C++ because it forces you to understand what's going to happen with everything, with memory. You know, God forbid you want to do something with a bitmap, you know, like, and I feel like that's something that we've really haven't to be reckoned with in the studio. So yeah, we spent a pretty brutal 6 months changing completely how we were doing things. We're about to completely break up with Kubernetes and essentially hand our data over to our users. Not only will it save us an absolute fortune, but it will provide us the ability to give way more functionality and control to the users as well, reducing our downtime and stuff like that. So I think, I haven't looked into the Google Cloud stuff yet. No, I'm not.
Better. Yeah,
I'm not against that backend stuff, but I think we have this phrase
is Google Cloud is like, again, you could put in AWS, you could put in Azure. It's a flavor. It's kind of like how you know how we're like Unity, Unreal. I think Google Cloud's actually a really good cloud, but again, I've worked with it for 5 years, and it's got all the features that I need to do the backend stuff. And I use this cute little language called Golang that when I'm not doing my okay, I've got to be on the metal, and I even prefer C over C++, right? Because I feel like C++ is too high level. But Golang, it just frees you up, and you're writing that C# like stuff that your guys are writing, right? But I would never do a real-time system using it. It's good for an IO bound backend, but you can still shoot your foot off. But what I found is like, what really gets me as an engineer is like, there's more lines of code in Kubernetes than in my backend. Red is super stable, super old, beautiful, elegant C program, and you know, like.
So we use Redis for storing our so session data that someone has is basically a binary blob of crap from Unreal, and we dump that into Redis. I got very intimate with this when we had an outage at 2 a.m. and everyone else was dead, and I was the only person left up, and I was having to install these ridiculously named programs too. I want to see if it's still installed on my thing, but it was like, you know, and you get really mad when it's like you're installing curl to do this bizarre thing here, and, you know, Helm this and do that.
It was, but when we were in our Kubernetes phase, I was like, I've got to do Istio just so I can send some fucking data, and then Helm, and then this, and I'm like, fucks, make it stop, just make it work.
And I think we've really. A big outcome we got from our lessons learned was to develop a strong culture of why. We ended up with a lot of siloing. Our back-end team would be just doing stuff because, this is what everybody's doing on, you know, Stack Overflow or whatever. So we developed a lot of things. We were making GUIDs for stuff, and I'd be like, why is that keyed with a GUID? And no one could even tell me. And I'm like, cool, we're throwing that around. We're keying our database with a string with no indexing. And now we're wondering why at, 100,000 records, we're having problems. And so
SQL is not bad, man. We still use SQL for some stuff.
You have to obey rules with it. And I still think just where we're at with MTU, with databasing, with everything, you really need to be asking what the size of stuff is. I'm not good at remembering stuff, and so my most visited web page would be a like C# and C++ data sheet about the size of different data types. You know, how many bytes is a long? You know, and I think whenever I see someone keying something with a long, I'm like, cool, count to like 4 trillion for me. You know, what's going to happen when your game gets to 4 trillion objects? Or it's more than that, but you know, if you can't count to it, then it's
probably okay. So let's talk about RocketWerkz. So when you first founded it, you left DayZ. 2014, I think, moved down to Dunedin, cloudiest place in the world, I understand. And you started working. Did you start working on Ion right away, or did you have?
Yeah. So actually, So what happened was to stop having a mental breakdown with where DayZ was at. It was really hard with DayZ because it was like cooking in someone else's kitchen.
Yeah.
It wasn't so much that. It was honestly more me. I came out of nowhere, which was good, but I had a lot I had to learn at the same time. So I kind of recognized that. And I was trying to, cook in someone else's kitchen in a country that I didn't speak the language.
Just the whole Bohemia interactive thing.
Yeah. And I love working with Marek. He's fantastic. But all of this had happened to me like very quickly. So I was working in Prague at the time on Arma 3 when DayZ came out. And so this was all an accident. And so I sort of, at a certain point, I sort of started to fall over. And so I started to disengage from DayZ even while
you needed to get back.
Really.
You needed to get back and be grounded in your own home space.
Exactly. And also, I recognized that there was a lot I needed to learn. There was a lot I knew and a lot I'd picked up over a period of time. And it wasn't like I hadn't had jobs in the game industry before. I'd worked at She Interactive in New Zealand, now Pickpock. I was a producer there and on a couple of games. And I'd worked for flight sim companies making add-ons. So they make quite a bit of money, a lot of them actually, making add-on.
I mean, there is money in niche if you hit the right niche,
So there was that, and then I think it was around the time I first ended up catching up with you. My agents had actually,
it was around E3, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah, and I was very fascinated with Space Station 13, and I'd been working on my own little prototype. I'd essentially modded Space Station 13. Actually, I suppose my prototype basically looks very much like Among Us.
I was actually about to say it.
Now
does
I
have
think
a similar
about it.
look to it. Yeah.
And actually, just before I left DayZ, the advice I gave Marek, I was like, for the next Arma, do Arma Online. And my other piece of advice was, I called it DayZ Arena. So it was like, do DayZ Arena, which basically would have been PUBG.
Yeah. Totally.
And I ended up knocking teeth with the Improbable folks. And I'd sort of earmarked, I think it was like 2 million US to work on this little prototype of mine. And they were like, why don't we do it in here? And so
they were going around. That was the E3 when they were going around every studio in LA. Can I tell you a secret?
Sure.
I got a cool secret. This is the first time this has been said. They came around to us and we were at Respawn, and they basically explained to us how the hardest thing, that could be done would be to work out how to put Santa hats on everybody at Christmas, and as if that's the hardest thing when you're working on Titanfall. And my colleagues had already made Call of Duty. They were so confident that they could actually re-implement Titanfall entirely with their engine that they actually convinced some of our management to give them the source code for Titanfall 1 with a promise that we'll implement it in whatever their engine was called at the time in a month. And I never heard from them again. Never heard from them again.
I'm trying to remember.
Of course, it's just totally, it's way out of left field. It had nothing to do with how we made these games. So,
well, I think a lot of any business relationship comes down to trust, and 90% of trust is the people who are involved. So I know for me, I've always had a lot of respect and still do for Nick Button Brown, and a bunch of other people. And so I do think, though, the caution is you can still get a great group of people get together and be heading or led in the wrong direction as well.
And also it could just be the product is too early or doesn't quite suit your needs or has some sort of very specific thing that won't fit what you're trying to create.
And you have to be able to explain how much something's going to cost.
Yeah,
that's the big thing. If people can't explain how much something's going to cost, then you have a real problem, particularly if it's going to be a centerpiece of what you're trying to do. And looking through the, I suppose, carrots that you get given at the start. You know, Microsoft is great at this. You know, oh, use this thing, it's free. Well, it's free now, but how much is it going to cost when, you know, the training wheels come off? And I think that business people, you know, making the decisions at game companies need to, you know, do a better job at looking through the sweeteners.
What's going to be the cost per user when we ship our game with this per month? Cost per user per month. Can we recoup that in game? If not, done, right? It's that simple.
Yeah. So that was pretty traumatic, really, that whole that whole project. And it was kind of a shame. I actually dusted off my prototype not long ago. And
it was a cool idea.
Yeah, and actually, I mean, there was an element of Among Us in there, but mostly actually it was very focused on creating the station organically. So it'd be like Among Us if you could actually build the station. I think hubris is very dangerous, and I think that we like to, and I think we even idolize people who really push what we can do very far, you know, the Elon Musks of the world. But I actually think if you look, you know, behind every Elon Musk is, you know, an engineer scratching their head, trying to think how we can actually
Gwyneth Shotwell, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think there's like with how brutal the game development market is at the moment. I don't think going out and buying magic beans from companies like Improbable is going to be how people get through this. I think it's actually going to be facing the cold, hard reality of things. You know, just like looking back at our internet infrastructure and going, cool, okay, MTU hasn't changed. A lot of the paradigms that we would have.
Where's, you know, it's 2022. Where's IPv6?
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
You know.
If you're counting a byte, if you need to send a byte, you might be able to reduce the size of it, but you still have to send something resembling a byte. You know, you might be able to get it down a bit smaller, but you're still having to send something, and you can't beat the, you know, laws of physics.
I think it's going to, I think in terms of bandwidth, I really think we're going to see like, I do, I'm not a fan of Improbable's technology, but I do think that there is a vision where bandwidth is more plentiful in the future, and we can have more immersive, larger experiences. And I'm talking 10 or 20 years, but it's very difficult for me to see 10 or 20 years from now. People like you need to be empowered to implement your creative ideas, and it shouldn't just be like some sort of like hyper experimental tech made by some kids who went to Cambridge, you know, or whatever. That no one's made a game with. It should be like, here's the battle-tested, proven thing that shipped 20 games over the last 10 years. It's great. It costs this much. Boom, 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 boom. I'll try that out. By the way, it's open source. I mean, that's where this needs to go.
My biggest problem with decentralization is the same reason. If you look at modding, right, the big mods, all the big successful game mods usually had a couple or even one person steering it. Really heavily. Whereas if you look at a lot of the mods, not all of them, but a lot of the mods that were open source, or even open source projects that fall over, in many cases, them being open source actually destroyed them a bit. I mean, I'm really
you gotta have the author. It's open source because as a game developer, you shouldn't use something that you don't have the source for. But not in the sense of like a million monkeys are pounding in the typewriter.
One of the great examples I can think of is DRM GUI. Have you used that?
I know. Yeah.
So I love DRM GUI. I adore it.
One guy.
It's one guy, and you see his thinking on a daily basis. You can pull it down. You can muck with it if you want, although I wouldn't recommend it because it's all magic and rainbows. But that to me represents solving a very specific problem in a very specific
it's compartmentalized. It just does this particular one
with a
it's
vision.
Opinionated about how you use it. It's not trying to be everything. Here it is.
It's not feature rich. It just does what it does. And if you want to go down this path with it, then you better damn well follow what it's going to say. So I think that's my issue with the things like what Improbable's doing, and even that all the Web3 stuff is I'm like, Why
kitchen
isn't
sink
Web3
syndrome.
talking about
It's
architecture?
like Kubernetes
standards?
all over again. It's Kubernetes all over again, basically.
If you aren't dealing with the architect, we weren't even able to get IPv6 out. Like, we've done a terrible job. And then with all these problems, then we invent UPnP, and it's like, okay, we're going to have a standard that's not even a standard. What's the rules with UPnP with the device? Well, there's not really any rules. Just nuke whatever device was using that port and just make your own one. You can do whatever you want. And it's like, that's not a standard, guys. That's not a solution to the problem.
It's like that comic problem. There are 14 competing standards. Create your own standard. Problem. Now there are 15 competing standards.
Or UPnP is basically just, it's a standard that says there's no standard if you use this. Yeah. It's the same when I was briefly doing I was trying to get a whole bunch of my flight sim devices to work with Armor. And so I was doing a bunch of
so this is how you know about all this,
USB.
because of all of the input devices for your flight sim stuff.
And I'm like, who came up with this? Who was sitting on the USB standards committee? Because I'm sure 90% of people were sitting there like this. And then there was just a bunch of crazy, people going off and just wanting to, I call it the Joint Strike Fighter problem, where you had this one issue here and it just started expanding out like this. And
so the Joint Strike Fighter problem is specifically like, the Navy wants this, the Army wants this.
And they all had their own projects, but then Congress is like, hey, you guys are making a plane and you guys are making a plane. Y'all should make a plane together. And the Army's like, I guess
we want our own plane, guys.
Maybe this will work out. And then they start talking, and it turns out, the Air Force want to do a very different thing from the Army. And you end up with this Frankenstein's monster
sort of
of a project.
like a design by committee thing. So I'm with you. I mean, definitely technically, I really feel like when I look at open source projects that I really admire. I mean, I like the single-mindedness of John Carmack at id, right? Redis is an excellent project. Like here's boom. I look at InGUI is a good example on your side. Also from a design point of view, I got to say, like, I'm more of and maybe different to the sort of games that you've made. I love that sort of Nintendo one thing done really well, but then when I look at it's like, it's now, let's get a game like DayZ. It's like a very broad, but perhaps a little rough initially, right? But you got to get that broad coverage for the realistic simulation.
I think it's more a question of, if you look at that Nintendo philosophy, that's more starting. You want to get to the same place with either DayZ or say a more Nintendo type game. With DayZ, you're just starting quite wide like a mod, and you're honing in towards.
So you pick particular parts, and you're like, we're going to get really good at reload, like inventory, and boom, permadeath, boom, right?
And I think that a philosophy I have is that a great game is more about what you don't put in it than you do. I think Titanfall would be a great example as well.
It's such a great example, because look at the success of Apex Legends as soon as they took wall running and Titans out.
But I think that how Titanfall was made, there's several people I've talked to just on that multiplayer front is, that's what I mean. Like, people want to look at things like, Improbables, magic beans, or even a lot of the Web3 stuff as being these great innovations. But I actually think the more boring stuff, looking at just, okay, how is Titanfall making a connection between a customer who has this insane router that looks like it's from the 60s, running through two super shady telecom companies, and all this cloak and dagger net negotiation and everything. That to me is more like, wow, that's impressive. How did they figure that out?
There's something really cool. So I was there right at the end of Titanfall, and all credit to the team. I just helped out a little bit at the end. But I got to work with a team of people who many of them had worked together on Call of Duty's way back. John Shiring, really, G-Song, Earl, Richard, tons of other guys, Chad, and these are all just badasses. Right. And different to me too, like coming from more of a, like, we did modding, a lot of the designers were modders like you. But what brought them all together is they had that Quake heritage, that whether it's the Infinity Ward Quake version of the engine, or and in fact on Titanfall, it was actually it was the source engine from Valve that was licensed and heavily modified by us. But we were inheriting all those things, Dean, about the NAT size and this and whatever. And yeah, there's a lot of crust in there, but you don't gut it. This is an accumulation of learning. Right.
And you have to have that fierce pragmatism. I call it a brutalist approach to game development. That's how we refer to it at the studio. And so, yeah, I think with our next games, you're going to really see a hard pivot away from approaching it like Icarus. We trusted a lot. And again, I don't want to feel like I'm pooping all over engines and that, but I think it's really important that with whatever tool you use, whether you've made it internally, or you're using an open source, or you're using an engine, or burning your money with Improbable or something, I think you have to be really skeptical, and you have to have that culture of why this, why is it keyed with a GUID, why is
John Shiring would come to me on Titanfall, at the end, and even all the way through Titanfall 2, and I'll be like, I want to do X. And John would be like, does that make the game any more fun? How does that make the game more fun? Shouldn't we work on things that make the game more fun? And it pissed me off so much at the time. I'd like, I've just got to do this. It's inefficient. I got to fix this. I got to use this. But at the end of the day, really, if it's not making the game more fun, what are we doing it for?
And I think that, we need to do a lot better job at, not just trying to fall over the next cool thing and actually really get to, I call it good old fashioned detective work, good old fashioned police work. It's like the same way, you watch any of those crime documentaries, they're like, oh, well, how did you catch the killer? It wasn't necessarily, I mean, DNA and all that kind of stuff that helps, but nothing replaces that good old fashioned police work of going out and, looking at the evidence on the papers and doing the work.
It's not a straight line. It's not a straight line. And sometimes you got to get out, you got to get people playing it. Sometimes the play tests at the office, let's talk about play tests briefly, because that's something that on Titanfall and the Call of Duty massively. It was like play tests organically occurring every weeknight, big design sessions, big feedback sessions. And this is all optional. And then, a company-wide play test Friday afternoon every week. And you're in it. And how can you make a multiplayer game if you're not playing it yourself, top to bottom, right?
So well, even single player games. So, we do the same even with single player games.
Okay, so tell me about the playtesting at your company. How do you guys do it for multiplayer?
Our core philosophy is games are played, not made. I think we recognize though. I can't remember. We have this concept of champions. So people who get the game, who understand it. And I think particularly on a big team, it's important to realize that not everyone will get the game.
Yeah. Can't be everything.
People need
for everybody.
to know. That's right. Some people are just going to be specialists who are really good, who are in to help you deal with the thing and then go. It's important to recognize that, because some people are like, they want to be a champion of the game, but they don't get the game. So they start trying to change the game and pull it in this direction. So you need to really know, but it's still important to get everyone playing it to see if it's broken. And I think those regular play tests, they give you a health indicator. And that's, you should be having a massive panic. It's like, I don't know what your rule is, but my rule with programmers is you really should be committing every day. I know personally for myself, even during massive refactors, I generally commit once every couple of hours. Yeah. And I'll let myself go off on these giant, like little refactoring adventures. But if I don't feel like I've made progress and an out-of-hour basis, it's boom, revert. And I try and break it down. So I think, we really try and make sure that the game is always playable, that everything we do is playable.
Anytime someone diverges off the game and diverges off into a little, like it has to keep coming back into the game. And if you're going too far off, it means your tech's not ready. Hey, on Titanfall 2, I completely rewrote the snapshot and delta encoding system live and in while everyone was playing. And I just kept checking it in if deft out.
Yeah.
For a fucking year, dude. For a year. And then when we turned it on, of course, open season on Glen, the sound guys were great because I was like, hey guys, could you like listen to the third person hearing someone shooting? And then they found all these bugs but I fixed them anyway. It wasn't even me. But it's like, you've got to get out there and go, I've got something new. I'm turning on something new. Can everyone look for things wrong with it? Right.
Yeah. And I think, I definitely think that philosophy, you don't get that process unless you're playing the game regularly.
Yep. What do you do if someone's not playing the game? I don't want.
Well, you make them. That's but it is hard, and we're still struggling with it now when the teams get into a rhythm. So we do weekly cadences in terms of patches. Yep. That's brutal. Yep. But it's helped keep us focused. We let the teams choose their, well, actually, if Icarus turned around and said, no, we're not doing weekly cadence, we'd make them. But the Stationeers team, they chose it. And in fact, it came up in our last retro. The team were really liking getting that weekly cadence going. I think if you go,
it's a big deal.
If you go too fast, if you go too slow, everyone can end up tripping over each other.
Diverge too much, and then it's not really on the main line. Yeah.
But if you can't play your game for a period of a month or two during your development, unless you've got deep pockets and a lot of time, that's a massive red flag. I think if we knew it was a problem at the time, but we really should have recognized. I mean, we did, and we talked about it at our steering groups, and that we were like, this is bad. Like, we can't play the game. We go to try and do our weekly play test, and we physically can't join each other's game. And you can't just pause everything. People have to go off and do work, but now they're going off and doing work blind. I
was about to say everyone's blind. Yeah. There's another sort of blindness I've noticed, which is when you launch a game, but you don't have enough telemetry and enough analytics in it to see what players are feeling and thinking.
Biggest bugbear. But even not just what players are seeing and thinking, even just raw data around how much bandwidth are you using? Yeah. The amount of times, because every now and then I get dragged into someone's having a bad launch, right? And they're like, oh my God, our servers are burning. And they'll be like, oh, well, let's drag Dean out. And the first question I'll ask usually is, okay, what's your bandwidth? Oh, we don't know. Okay, that's bad. How many game objects are you supporting? What's your maximum? What's your minimum? What's your bandwidth usage per game object? What's the typical game set? All that kind of stuff. It's kind of scary how often the answer is, oh, we don't know. Yeah, a lot of people maybe who you end up working with are actually starting to ask these questions. But at that indie level, I think there's a real sea change that's going to need to come where people realize they have to start thinking about that. The engine isn't going to do all that thinking.
It's as important as frame rate. You don't get good frame rate without thinking about it. You don't get good bandwidth without thinking about it.
And honestly, SyncVar and all of that, like RPCs and that, they've got a lot to answer for. Actually, the convenience with which you can synchronize data is bad, because you get into this situation where designers are choosing what gets synchronized and then choosing how. If you can go in and say, oh, well, this should be synced probably once every second. Now you don't know for sure when that's going to get updated. It's super sloppy.
So there's a different way that we do it on Quake games, where a snapshot of the entire world state is captured like 10 or 20 times a second. I found your threads. So that's my philosophy as well. That's a good way to do it, because it's just like your trains example, because you're like, no, it doesn't matter if I have a weapon and an attached object and this, they're all arriving at the same time.
But people go, oh, well, that means we're going to need to send a lot of data. Yes.
That's why you delta compress it.
That's right. So,
but to be fair, easier said than done. I mean, so let me go back and give you a counterpoint on this. So there is a flip side, which is premature optimization. Like, well, we can't have that many objects. We can't do this and whatever. And John Sharing at Respawn on Titanfall, here's what he did. He just used the source engine, which by the way was let's just say a fairly decent structure for synchronizing world state. Okay, like professionally done, shipped a few games, Counter-Strike, Quake, been there. But we didn't sweat the small stuff, and it got kind of chunky, right? So basically, I came in literally after Titanfall launched. And I spent maybe 1-2 years optimizing the bandwidth on the game. That was what Titanfall shipped with. And that's what enabled the single player, because it couldn't do as many objects as the single player. And it's what enabled Apex eventually having so many objects in such a large map. But that wasn't something that stopped Titanfall 1 from shipping. They went out there and went, it's a bit fat, it's a bit whatever. But John always had the attitude of like, look, I don't want to be saying no to the designers, right? And when I worked on God of War, designers were asking for awesome stuff on God of War Ascension, like, we want more enemies, we want lots of AIs and I'm like, can't do it, bandwidth. Now I was right technically, but the correct answer was probably like, game's got to be fun, number one.
Yeah, I think though, like you asked me at the start, what made DayZ great, and I realize now probably what I should have said was what I usually say is, it was built out of compromise. So DayZ was a product of what you could do with armor. Yeah. And if you sat down and said, we can do anything, you like, that's why DayZ hadn't existed.
It wasn't tilting at windmills. It was informed pragmatically by what an existing engine that had shipped games can do. It's like,
okay, Chernarus, the map, nothing in armor uses all the map. You can't, right? Yeah. So how do we get players moving around the map? How do we get them experiencing the map over time and moving around and stuff like that? So it was very, very much a product of what can we do with what's here. That's why I sort of half jokingly say at work, I hate features in terms of game engine and tools, because I think if you sit down and say to someone, like with my train game, I had all these mechanisms to send information. I made a fragmentation system, and I had an immediate fragment, and then I had a fragment on a tick. Then one day I realized during testing, I'd actually turned off my immediate fragment, and all my data was only being sent every 50 milliseconds. Yeah. And
you realized
I didn't even notice.
Two types. Yeah.
Yeah. I was like, I didn't even notice. I was doing a test with someone in the UK, another person from like Singapore and New Zealand, and none of us noticed the latency. So I think, obviously that's not going to be the case for every game, but I do think that not just giving absolute freedom for people to do anything, you get a lot of problems. We had a terrible problem on Icarus. We had like huge frame rate issues during one of our playtests. It was like, 15 frames a second. We couldn't figure out why. We just, it was only a week or two after having done this big frame audit. We finally dialed in, and it was because someone had added a light to the particles that were the fireflies by the lake, and shadows were turned on. So we had all these dynamic lights on fireflies around the lake. Could you imagine how? Oh my god, I'm getting like anxiety just thinking about it.
Titanfall 1's final level in single player, there was an intro where you had the solar system and whatever. I found out somewhere in Titanfall 2 that was all active and running underneath the map throughout the entire game.
Just reminded me, yesterday we just found out in Stationeers. We're actually telling, not a lie, but we're being conservative with the truth in the patch notes. So hopefully no Stationeers players watch this. But we discovered that our shadow, so we alter the shadow usage for structures the further you get away from it. So the more distant lights still shine, but they don't have their shadows turn on because they don't need it. That didn't work. Everything was just still on their casting shadows. And so it wasn't applying the system, even though it was doing all the checks and everything in our occlusion system. So it was
actually more expensive. It was more expensive because it was doing all the work and then doing nothing with it.
Pretty healthy bump to our render frame, actually. But that was just a classic example of, and actually I've often talked about writing a tool for Unreal and one for Unity as well that basically requires people at a build level to get approval to have dynamic shadows turned on a dynamic light. I'm not joking. I think you should have to do a special check-in command that, because we try and have a really good build process. And so I reckon you should have to do a special check-in command to turn that on.
So on Titanfall, it chapped my ass, but on Titanfall, all the way through it, every programmer had to build and run all the executables, run them, verify frame rate at a test level, and check it in.
Yes,
We actually checked in binaries, and that's
you know
what
what?
playtest ran off.
That's right. Yeah, and do you know
Because you can't check in without testing the game.
Oh, I like that,
Because
I've been
you're
trying to
fucking
figure
fired,
out.
by the way.
Yeah, I've been trying to figure out how to do that.
I don't recommend this for everybody. And I was like, don't you have a build machine, guys?
And don't let people use PIE or.
But there was a wisdom in this, which is like, you're going to build and run it, and then you're going to make a change, and suddenly it's now 10 FPS because there's shadows on fairies, right?
And also, it avoids the problem of people going, oh, well, it worked PIE, player and editor. It worked in that.
Yep.
So with Art of the Rail, my little train game, I don't even use Unity's editor. I make my own prefab editor because my prefabs are generated from XML anyway.
Yeah.
It's funny because when we want to move stuff around when we're making new objects for Stationeers and Unity's editor, I actually do it in Notepad++ because Unity's so crappy.
Is this for iteration time for you? Is this because you want the quick iteration time, or?
Well, no, it's because they use GUIDs and their own system screws up sometimes and destroys all your references. So it's much easier if you want to clone an object, but you want to change what the base script type is on it. Maybe you want to clone it so that you're using a child class of the one that's there. You can actually just go into the ASCII text and just change the GUID to point it at the other script.
Nothing wrong with that.
References.
There's just nothing wrong with that. So when I was working on God of War, there was like the design team was it was interestingly kind of cleft in twain, right? Like there were like people who were like editing text files, and if you make me open up an editor and to do something, I will fucking murder you, right? And then there were people who were like, no, I'm in Maya, and if you make me edit a text file, you're dead. And yeah, I'm sure there was some hybrids between, but it was so interesting because the level designers were so into Maya, and the combat designers were so text-based. Now,
but I think
there was a combination of the both. But
yeah, I think I like to follow like
I'm a text guy. I'm
all of the above. I think the key important thing is the core data structure. You have to get that right. And then your tools will reveal themselves over time. So with Art of the Rail, I have I follow kind of a city skylines approach. So I have a lot of little models, and then I call them visualizers. I can put them together as a constellation. And that's what City Skylines does. You make a bench, you make a this, you make a that. And this building is a bunch of these things. And so then when you want to render that bench can get batched with all the other benches. And so then I made, my own editor to allow all that to get added together. And I think that what that meant was it did kind of make it weird exporting from Max, because you export the meshes, but then you might be reusing another mesh. So then I started writing Max tools to allow me to do that. So, and I think that's why I like to be a bit organic about how the tools develop. Get the data structure right.
You can go either way.
Yeah.
That's cool. It's very pragmatic. Well, dude, so tell us a bit about the future for multiplayer that you see, and maybe how RocketWerkz will be a part of that. What do you think is going to come up over the next 5 or 10 years in multiplayer? Where do you see it going?
I think customer expectation has never been higher. Gone are the days that people are okay with port forwarding and stuff like that.
Yep.
There are obviously a pretty big segment of the regular multiplayer crowd who understand that, but there's a lot of people that just won't accept it. So I think multiplayer is getting sold more and more as this generic, the engine does everything for you. I don't believe that's true at all. I think that's never been less true. I think it's never been more risky to give your designers access to choose how things are getting synchronized, because the base architecture hasn't changed of the internet. People can talk about Web3 and all that crap as much as they want, but the MTU, call me when IPv6 is fully everywhere. Call me when that goes up.
I'll let you know when we have IPv6 and 10 gigabits per player.
That's right. Exactly. Because that didn't happen. So it's like the emperor's new clothes. Everyone's pretending, everyone's off chasing
we might have next gen consoles and PCs more powerful than God, but we've still got 1500 byte MTU.
Yeah,
And,
that's right.
Obviously, the speed of light's not going anywhere.
Yeah, so you can say
hard.
you don't need to worry about the size of stuff in memory all you want, but that's not true. You absolutely do need. So I think that if you look at, and to my opinion, the games that are successful in the multiplayer area, they've dealt with this and they've really thought about this. They've been reserved. They've been careful about what they're synchronizing and how they're synchronizing. So I think it's more of the same from 20 years ago, while all this other nonsense is going on.
Yep. All right, man. So if anyone wants to work with you down in Auckland, where can they go? And what are you looking to hire for?
We haven't been hiring a lot. We let the numbers sort of go down a bit after Icarus through attrition, just because we wanted to see what was going to happen with COVID and recession and that, and we wanted to make sure we were going to scale up when we got a big thing. I'm hopping on a plane and going to Gamescom soon, though. So I think
cool.
We do have a couple of prototype things to what our next big thing's going to be, but I think we wanted to learn our lessons from the lessons learned, get Icarus on the right track and Stationeers on the right track. Stationeers is kicking butt. It's been we doubled the revenues. It's doing nearly the same revenues that Icarus is. And the customer satisfaction's way up. But we haven't got to that point with Icarus yet. So we need to turn the corner. Yeah. I think we'll see that towards the end of the year. Then we'll be ready to expand again. So
you launch the game and then the hard work begins.
Well, I think, you have to do a massive soul search. And so we're still at the last stages of applying or proving that we've applied those lessons.
Awesome. Dean, thank you so much for having a chat with me today. Good luck on your flight to Gamescom, and I wish you absolutely best for your studio moving forward.
Yeah, I can't wait to catch up again. In the meantime, it's every time I Google something, I'll come across something you've said. Seriously, I'm going to send you
10-year-old me.
It makes me chuckle.
Me of 20 years ago. Dean, it's like the light of a star in the sky. That star is really no longer there. It's just billion years old light.
Or it's like when you Google something and you end up on Stack Overflow and you're like, oh, that's a really good explanation. And then you look at the username and realize it's you.
Yeah, good stuff, mate. All right,
awesome.
See you at Gamescom. Cheers, everybody.
Here's the hard truth. The internet doesn't care about your game. After all the blood, sweat and tears you put into making your game, you launch, and some players get terrible network performance. What can you do about it? Build your own internet? This is why we created RocketWerkz. RocketWerkz is a radically new way of linking networks together. It's a new internet. One where networks compete on a neutral marketplace to carry your game's traffic. RocketWerkz puts you, the game developer, in control of the network. We monitor every player's network performance and you choose when to accelerate them. Not only will you see better network performance for your players, you'll also have the security of knowing that if one network is congested, we switch to another in seconds. Now you control the network.